Good morning and welcome to episode 11 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Joining me today is Mia O'Brien. We are presented by Injury Care Centers. Before we get to our topic today, we're going to do a little bit of Jags trivia like always. The last time the Jaguars played the Texans, which is their opponent this week, Trevor Lawrence passed for 364 yards, which is the second highest mark in his career. Which team did Lawrence record his best career game against in terms of passing yards? And it was an AFC South team. Was it the Texans again, the Colts, or the Titans? It was the Titans back in 2022 in week 14, I believe. I think that was a game where Evan Engram had a really big performance and the Jags won 36-22. So we'll see if Trevor Lawrence and the offense can get back on track this week. But Mia, today you and I are actually going to talk about the defensive side of the ball and how the Jaguars can possibly hope to contain CJ Stroud and more specifically the three wide receivers that they have there in Houston between Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs, and Tank Dell. So I'll let you just kind of lead it off with wherever you want. What do you think is the most interesting part of this matchup?
Well, first and foremost, as you referenced that 300-plus yard performance by Trevor Lawrence, in my preparation for today's episode, I looked at a lot of plot charts between last year and this year for a bunch of quarterbacks in the National Football League, just so, happened to include Trevor Lawrence and CJ Stroud. And I knew last year how damning it was, how much the Jaguars ignored the middle of the field past 15 yards. But when you see it on a plot chart and then you see all the yellow for incompletions along the sideline, and then you look at this year through 3 weeks of the season and that plot chart, and you do see a little more middle of the field. You don't see a lot of dots to begin with because the Jaguars, unfortunately, before Monday night really didn't throw the ball all that much. And once again, nothing but yellow along the sideline. And that's where I think, unfortunately, Trevor Lawrence doesn't have this triple threat, this three-headed monster that CJ Stroud does at wide receiver. Not to say his wide receivers aren't more than capable enough, but certainly having these three guys creates opportunities along the boundary. Although I think as we're going to discuss today, Gus, we kind of debunk a little bit this idea of the Texans just wanting to air it out 50 yards downfield every single play.
Yeah, especially last year, I think we saw the Texans have a pretty high early down run rate because Bobby Sloak, their offense coordinator, is from the Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay tree. And so he wants to kind of like establish the run a little bit, or not necessarily establish the run in the way that Pete Carroll once wanted to do in Seattle, where you're truly running the ball more than 50% of the time, but really just establish it enough to open up the play action attack because CJ Stroud was certainly as good last year without play action than he was with play action. But the play action game in Houston last year was pretty bonkers with Tank Dell and Nico Collins, and they were able to create a lot of explosives from that. But a large part of that reason was because they were committed to the run game, especially on early downs. And so they really made opposing defenses have to respect the run. And so I think we've actually seen the Jaguars offense kind of try to do that this year, but their running game has been not bad, but just not good enough to kind of like get the looks that they want for their play action looks. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, this season, I think it's been kind of like the same course for the Texans, where like they still have Bobby Sloak, and even if Stefon Diggs was added to the room, I think his role is basically like their third down go-to guy because they still want to have the same early down plan where they're running to set up play action so they can take these deep shots with CJ Stroud. But then whenever they do get into like a 3rd and 7 or a 3rd and 8 or something like that, that's when Stefon Diggs puts on his little superhero cape and comes to save the day because they're able to get him into a matchup that they like and they're confident in him winning one-on-one.
I think that's a great place to start, Gus, as we dive specifically into these three wide receivers and how they've operated in cohesion together. There was so much talk in the offseason of the first game that Stefon Diggs only has one catch on 2 targets. Is he going to be a prima donna? Is he going to complain? I think what's most fascinating when you look at the Houston Texans as a team is that, yes, Stefon Diggs is playing almost every single snap in the slot. That takes away from Robert Woods, who was their leading receiver in the slot last season. Certainly, Nico Collins saw 6% of his snaps last year in the slot, so that's down about 4%. And we also have to go back to this idea of the emergence of Nico Collins as a wide receiver one, which ironically enough did not occur until Tank Dell went down against the Jaguars in week 13. And so, or week 12. And so that's what's so interesting is that I think what you're seeing right now, they're sharing the wealth most definitely. And if anyone's kind of the odd man out, and this is kind of how I kind of pitched this segment to you, Gus, it's Tank Dell. And even when you go on PFF or Next Gen Stats, he literally is listed as wide receiver 3, which if you had told anyone week 9 or week 10 of last year that Tank Dell would be wide receiver 3 in this system, you'd be shocked. And so I think what's interesting is while there was this idea of Diggs is going to take all the receptions away from those two players, that really hasn't been the case. If anything, I think Collins becoming that go-to catches 95.2% of catchable passes thrown his way receiver, can line up in the slot or could line up outside, akin to, dare I say, a Justin Jefferson, Dan Orlovsky's words, not mine. That is where you're seeing a drop in production from Dell, coupled with, of course, he is coming off of a significant leg injury, let alone the fact that he was also shot in the offseason. And so that's kind of the what I want to explore today is Tank Dell and why we haven't seen more of him. Could we potentially, I know he's hurt too, which also kind of throws this topic for quite the curveball, because when I saw that report yesterday that Aaron Wilson of KPRC is saying he may not even play now, according to people within Dell's camp. So that's certainly interesting, but it is fascinating that he's the one who has seen the drop in his not even snaps, but in terms of targets and in terms of catches so far through 3 games.
Right. I think the drop off in snaps is pretty easily explainable, which is just that Stefon Diggs showed up. And so now that whenever they're in 3 wide receiver sets, I'm sure Tank Dell was going to be out there 99% of the time. But anytime they want to go to heavier personnel, which they don't do a ton or even like as much as other Shanahan type teams, I feel like, but because they do want to get that run game going, they still go to it. And so anytime it's 2 receiver sets, which is probably about 10 to 20% for them, then they'll usually have Nico Collins and Steph Diggs out there. And so the arrival of Stefon Diggs definitely had like a clear impact on Tank Dell's snaps. But other than that, like, I think that's the only biggest difference so far. I mean, I know that the targets and the production is also down, but to me, that's more of like a small sample variance thing, because he still had 17 targets through 3 games, which is actually tied with Christian Kirk for 50th in the league among all players, not just wide receivers. And so even if he's not like the 1B to Nico Collins' 1A anymore, I think that Tank Dell is still like pretty fairly heavily involved. And it's just that because there's a decent amount of mouths to feed in that Texans receiver room, it's hard to know like who's going to kind of like go off at any one point. But honestly, like you said just a couple minutes ago, that Tank Dell now is expected to possibly miss the game due to, I think, a lower leg injury. But he'll at least be questionable, and so his status is up in the air. But if he were certainly playing, then I would have predicted like a bounce back game out of him, just because I think it's a matter of time until he has a big performance. Like for anyone who watched the Monday Night Football game between the Bears and the Texans, Tank Dell dropped a pass that would have been like a 70-yard touchdown if he'd be able to catch it and then keep going on the run. And so I think like apparently Tank Dell and CJ Stroud are like best friends on and off the field. And so I think it's just a matter of time until Tank Dell's stat line looks a little bit closer to what we saw last year.
Yeah, so I see our friend Dell in the comments noting Brian Flores' game plan last week against the Houston Texans. We could certainly dive into that a little bit. I want to look big picture, but we can absolutely look at a game in which this trio was locked up. And of course, if you have any comments, we would love to see them, some interaction, of course, and then we will have some chat therapy at the end of today's episode. The biggest statistical drop-off that I was able to find, because trust me, I was up last night looking at it. I was looking this morning. I'm like, where can we pinpoint where there's this drop-off with Tank Dell? And where did Brian Flores perhaps, even double down on that? Although I actually have an example of maybe where Bobby Slowick was able to find, okay, this is where Tank Dell fits into our offensive scheme now with the presence of Stefon Diggs. The one stat that I could find is that he caught 83.3% of his catchable passes this year. He caught 86.2% of his catchable passes last year. Last year, CJ Stroud had a 61.5% completion percentage when targeting Tank Dell. This year, it's down to about 52%. And I think to your point, if he catches that long touchdown pass, I think that number is skewed a little bit. The other number that I come back to is that as an offense as a whole, this team so far this season is not airing it downfield through 3 games. So again, very small sample size. And if you had added in that what would be 70-yard touchdown, that changes a lot of things. They're not going downfield nearly as much as they have in previous seasons. Field position certainly part of that, but here are some numbers to also keep in mind. Last year, and again, this is throughout the course of the regular season and 2 playoff games, the Texans saw that their completed targets, 23.6% of them came from the slot position. Majority was Robert Woods, a little bit Nico Collins as well. 13.1% of their targets that were completed were deep balls, over 20 yards down the field. This year, that number is down to 9.2%. And again, it's a small sample size. You factor in that one play, but the fact that we've seen that drop in percentage points coupled with, and for me, this was the most shocking number of all. Last year, CJ Stroud was 3 of 7, 20-plus yards down the field. This year, 30 yards. Sorry, let's do 30 yards first. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So 30-plus yards downfield. He was 1 of 2. He is 1 of 2. So he's only thrown the ball down the field plus over 30 yards twice this year, and he has 1 completion. Last year, he was 10 of 24 with 4 touchdowns, 30-plus yards down the field. And again, that's over the course of 19 games. This is over the course of 3 games, so that number could obviously change. But that was so jarring to me, especially when you look at it from a plot chart perspective, that you see how many times they even look to go 30-plus yards downfield. And so much of it is situational. Bobby Slowick, to your point, wants to run the ball and establish the run, that Shanahan offense. They also recognize, hey, look at what the defense is giving us. But that was very jarring. And then you couple that with 20-plus yards down the field this year. 7 attempts. So now if we put the 2 together, that's 7, because I included the 1 of 2 in that 3 of 7. So 7 total attempts, 20-plus yards downfield this year for CJ Stroud through 3 games. Yeah. And that included one of his interceptions that he threw last week against Brian Flores and the Minnesota Vikings. Last year, CJ Stroud was 38 of 52, 20-plus yards down the field. So again, that's where I think that it's a small sample size, but you could make the argument that they aren't going as deep this year. And probably part of that is they want to get Joe Mixon going. I know he missed last week. They want to get Cam Akers going. They also have Stefon Diggs, who can operate in a shorter field and can operate over the middle, perhaps more than a Nico Collins, who you want to be more fluid and be able to bend to the boundary. And so it's interesting. It's a small sample size, but when I was trying to find, hey, why are we not seeing more Tank Dell? Perhaps that's because Tank Dell truly was their go-to go-ball threat a year ago, and they just haven't been looking downfield nearly as much.
Yeah, I don't know what it is in terms of, I think there's definitely probably some rust that Dell is shaking off a little bit from his just off-season incidents. And then also, I wonder if they're trying to make sure that Stefon Diggs is used enough that, I don't think they're worried about, him getting pissed off or anything. I'm pretty sure he was actually voted a team captain in Houston this year. And so I don't think there's any, drama there. But I think they do want to make sure that he's well enough involved that it's just an efficient and well spread out offense. And so, I think, again, to your point, I agree where I feel like that drop off in deep passing is directly related to the way that Tank Dell has produced this season, because Nico Collins leads the league in receiving yards, and he has 50 more receiving yards than any other player, which is remarkable through just 3 weeks of the season. And so, speaking of Nico, though, man, that guy is insane. He's easily a top 10 receiver. I know
which is crazy, Gus, because number one, he did nothing his first 2 years in the league, and you can make the argument he didn't have a quarterback. But he also came from an offense in college that didn't air the ball downfield. And so talk about a hidden gem that Caserio and company were able to find, because, and also the whole, Michigan, Ohio State thing. I kind of get a kick out of that with CJ Stroud and Nico Collins having gone to rival colleges. But like, if you had told me in 2021 that this guy would be a top 10 wide receiver, arguably a top 5, top 6, like, no way in hell, right?
Yeah, I loved him coming out of college, but like I thought he was going to be like a better version of DJ Chark, basically.
Right.
Like, I still like way undersold him, but this guy is so well-rounded. He's the prototypical X receiver where he lines up on the line of scrimmage, can just bully opposing defensive backs. Like he really has a lot of Andre Johnson in his game, another former Texans receiver, because he's just so big and physical. But then, as you kind of mentioned earlier, he's super fluid in his routes, especially running digs over the middle. Like he and CJ Stroud, like that dig connection that they have just over the middle of the field is perfect. And so like I was talking to someone from the Texans recently and said I wouldn't be surprised if Nico Collins turns a 15-yard dig into a 50-yard touchdown, just because that's how good he is and that's how bad the Jaguars defense have looked so far. And so we can kind of turn it to, I think, how the Jaguars defense can go about stopping the three receivers, but then also the offense in general on Sunday. H-Town Highlights did comment on YouTube that he thinks the league took notice of what Stroud was able to do with deep passing last year, and that defenses are playing more shell defenses against the Texans, like more too high safety coverages, which makes a lot of sense just in general, but especially because like we've seen that across the entire league. Trevor was actually asked at the press conference yesterday, like why passing is down a little bit and rushing is up a little bit league-wide, and he said the same reason, where it's teams are implementing more shell defenses to take away explosive plays. So that's a good point from H-Town Highlights. Thanks for the comment.
Yeah, and of course, the Texans lead the NFL, according to PFF, in explosive plays with 25. That's defined as plays in the receiving game that go for 15 or more yards. And so, yes, I expect the Jaguars to play more cover two, which is the defensive scheme that CJ Stroud has faced the most when he's dropped back so far this season. 16 of 24 against cover two, according to PFF. What's interesting, once again, though, Gus, is that he has a 7.8 ADOT, so the average depth of target against cover two, a 5.9 yard per attempt against cover two. That's pretty middle of the road for him. By far, if they're looking to air it out, you've seen it the most when they're facing cover one. They're 9 of 11 when dropping back against cover one. And so I expect to see a lot of cover two from Ryan Nielsen. We'll get to the bigger conversation of man, zone. Do they have the horses for courses here in just a second? But it should be noted, as I went through each defensive coverage that the Texans have faced this season, and I made notes of, okay, they were sacked once against cover one. They were sacked 4 times when they've faced cover 3. The sack numbers are up across the board. And that is a Texans offensive line that was praised so much last season when it was a rotating door. The idea of having to bring guys in literally off the street, fit them into that scheme. They were able to do so seamlessly. By metrics, technically, they were the most injured offensive line in the National Football League last year. And yet now that they have a lot of those pieces back, they've actually given up more pressures and more sacks than through 3 weeks this time a year ago. And so that, I think, is really interesting. CJ Stroud has been sacked 4 times when facing cover 2. He has had to scramble twice as well. And so, look, like we said, and like Mel Kiper has certainly made quite the talking point around the country, there's more cover 2 being run across the league. But I do think that the Jags' best chance at stopping CJ Stroud in general, regardless of what defensive coverage they're running, and I know this is a tough ask given what we've seen through 3 weeks, but it's quite simply to beat an offensive line that has been suspect at times through 3 weeks of the season. Additionally, and I really hit this home on Helmets and Heels yesterday, look, this is a Texans team that has racked up double-digit penalties each of the last 2 weeks out. And I understand this idea of Laramie Tunsil's an all-pro, and he doesn't care that he's going to get flagged for lining up a little bit behind the line of scrimmage or jumping because he wants to get a head start on the pass rusher that he's facing, and whatever, it's just another flag. At some point or another, though, Gus, doesn't that raise a little bit of a red flag that he's your leader and he doesn't care that he's getting 5-10 yard penalties that's dropping the offense further behind the 8 ball? And that for me says, you know what, if he's to jump off, if he's to line up wrong, And now all of a sudden you have the Texans in 2nd and 11, 2nd and 12. Again, I know it's a hard ask given what we've seen from the Jaguars pass rush through 3 weeks, but that's your best chance for success, regardless of if you're running man or zone on the back end.
I totally agree. I think the only way that the Jaguars have a chance in this game is if, obviously we're going to need to see anything out of the offense. But defensively, the pass rush really needs to get home on third downs, whether it's 3rd and long, which they should do, but then even on 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 2s, be able to get off of the field. And it's going to be largely based on the pass rush. And the biggest thing I'm looking for in the secondary is we kind of know that the Jags don't have the horses to hold up. Ronald Darby is having a nice season, but that's he's having the best season out.
That's it.
There, yeah.
At least he's healthy. I mean, and so that's a big question is, are you going to leave him on Nico Collins? I don't think size-wise that really matches up, but I think he's fast enough he could keep up with Nico Collins. Are you going to roll safety coverage over like the Vikings did a little bit? Is that the plan?
I think the biggest thing is that they have to mix up pre-snap looks, and they have to make CJ Stroud think both before and after the snap, because last week, they especially at the beginning of the game against the Bills, the Jaguars would just line up in their press man or just press coverage scheme. But it was really easy to see because Joe Brady would motion almost every single play. They were able to understand what coverage they were going to face, and Josh Allen was able to get rid of the ball in less than half of a second for the majority of dropbacks. And so they need to do a better job of disguising, I think, the Jaguars do this week. That's what made Brian Flores' game plan against CJ Stroud last week so good, is that he has so many guys at the line of scrimmage all the time. And so it's hard to predict exactly where the blitz is coming from, or if the blitz is even coming at all. Maybe all those guys at the line of scrimmage drop off into a zone coverage. And so Nielsen needs to do a better job, I think, this week of disguising stuff pre-snap and not letting CJ Stroud get indicators of what kind of coverage or what kind of defense he's going to face. Because if he does get an indicator, then he's just going to shred this defense apart, considering they, again, don't have the horses to hold up against the likes of Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs. And so I think that also includes mixing up a lot more zone coverage on the back end too, just to give your defensive players a chance. But really, they need to be unpredictable before and after the snap, just to give the pass rush a hope of getting home in time.
Yeah, and not that you can run cover 0 every play, but that is the coverage that certainly CJ Stroud has struggled against the most. I don't have the numbers in front of me how often the Jaguars have actually blitzed under Ryan Nielsen through 3 weeks of the season. So apologies on that. If somebody in the chat has it, please send it to us. Okay, Gus is going to pull it up for us. And so, yeah, to that point, that is what Brian Flores was able to do, and crowding the line of scrimmage, then dropping suddenly, 3 guys back into coverage. I also think that what was so funny to me in my research this morning, when you go to PFF and you look at coverage stats for the Jags, it says that they've had 129 coverage snaps, and yet they've lined up 151 times in a press coverage look. I was trying to figure that out, how you could possibly have defended 129 plays, but yet lined up in 151 press coverage look. I was like, I don't know, how that doesn't compute to me. But the point is again, this idea of, do the Jaguars have the horses for courses? I don't think they're going to be able to play the 70+% man-to-man defense that they did against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle with no Tyson Campbell. And yes, certainly to Dell's point, it will be a huge help to have Darnell Savage back. But at the same time, you also are going to have Monteric Brown opposite Ronald Darby, who looked great against Amari Cooper, or rather the ghost of Amari Cooper, and the Cleveland Browns offense. I don't know if he's going to be able to keep up with the likes of Nico Collins, with the likes of, if Tank Dell plays, because I saw him struggle against Keon Coleman in his 4.6 40 on Monday night. And that's not a knock on Monteric, who's a very high IQ player, but it's just the reality of, if you're going to leave him on an island, that's probably where CJ Stroud's going to go with the football, especially with how well Ronald Darby has played so far this season.
Absolutely. So the Jaguars rank 15th in blitz rate this season, according to Pro Football Reference. They blitzed 25.4% of the time, which was a little bit higher than I expected. I thought they would be more below average than average, but
it feels like they haven't been.
they're right in the middle of the pack, and so maybe it's just because some of the games have gotten away pretty quickly. I don't know.
Well, so that's the thing is like when you go across the board, right? The Jaguars defense, what do we make of it? Certainly giving up 47 points on Monday Night Football inflates a lot of these stats. But when you go up and down the statistics in the National Football League, they're kind of just in the middle, kind of in no man's land. There's a couple that are a little jarring, and I'll get to those right now. So the Jags have given up a 68.9% completion percentage, 16th in the National Football League, middle of the road. They've given up 33 first downs. That's ninth. That perhaps I think is the biggest culprit, even in those two games in which the defense played well enough to give the Jaguars a chance to win the game. Those longer drives that they were able to give up and thus the time of possession, that is certainly a question mark, even with a defense that held the Miami Dolphins to 20 points and the Cleveland Browns to 16. They do have, despite no takeaways yet this season, they do have 12 forced incompletions. That is 7th in the National Football League. To Gus's chagrin, they are also 3rd in missed tackles with 16. And finally, and this is the one that concerns me the most if you're a Jaguar fan heading into Houston this weekend, the Jaguars are 5th worst in opposing quarterback passer rating. And I think that is a byproduct of allowing quarterbacks to matriculate up and down the field. By the way, matriculate is my new favorite word. Shout out to Travis Etienne because he said it 6 times to me post-game, and it's a great word. And it does describe what the Jaguars offense wants to be and what the Jaguars defense unfortunately has been, which is allowing opponents to march up and down the field, 4 or 5 yard plays on each snap, as opposed to 50-yard bombs, which is, from what it appears, what the Jaguars are trying to do this year. And the success rate of that is few and far between. And when you look at what the Houston Texans are doing right now, it's exactly that. You don't have CJ Stroud airing the ball 30 yards downfield every other play. It's, hey, here's Nico on a bubble screen. Hey, here's Stefon Diggs slant route over the middle for 5, 6, 7 yards. And then you run the ball for 3, 4 yards. And all of a sudden, oh my goodness, it's a first down. So something's going to have to give for the Jaguars defensively. And I think if they can quite simply just get off the field and create some sort of pass rush, then all of this talk of how do you defend these 3 wide receivers, it will lend itself, even if you don't have the guys on the back end who can hold up in man coverage.
Mm-hmm. Part of the reason the Jags rank so lowly in passer rating against is because they haven't recorded an interception. They're the only team in the NFL that has yet to force a turnover this season. So I think that's another part of it. I said on, I think it was Monday night's episode of Duval Rundown, that Nielsen needs to be more of like an agent of chaos and like just create chaotic looks and just try to force a mistake by the opposing offense, because obviously there hasn't been a lot of mistakes so far by opposing offenses. And so I think obviously the pass rush needs to get home. We need to see a few interesting, exotic, not even necessarily exotic, but just like not bland and basic pre-snap looks from Nielsen.
Which is not what we thought we'd be getting.
Right. Like, yeah, for sure.
Well, just like we didn't think we'd be getting these hockey shift rotations. Like, I didn't know that was part of it. And I don't know. And
I know he definitely did that in Atlanta last year. But yeah, I think so far it's been a little bit underwhelming. But A, it's only been 3 weeks. And like he's only in his second year as a defensive play caller. So we can give him a little bit of time. And then B, like the Jaguars arguably have the worst offense in the NFL. And that obviously doesn't help. I know that like even if the offense played well Monday night, like regardless, the Jaguars defense played that poorly on Monday night. But for the course of the season, they haven't been helped out whatsoever. And so let's give Nielsen a little bit more time, and let's see if he can cook something up this week against the Texans and CJ Stroud and those good receivers. So, Mia, you got anything else you want to give a score prediction?
Yeah, I mean, at this juncture, it's kind of like the Gators last week when I said I can't pick them in good faith until proven otherwise. So I picked Mississippi State. Maybe it's a similar situation this Sunday in H-Town where I pick against the Jags and they prove me wrong. Although I don't think the Texans defense is nearly as holy, let's say, as Mississippi State's. And so even if the Jaguars defense was to score, 20 some odd points, I don't think that the Texans are going to give up 40 something. So I don't know. With that reason, this line has inflated from a 4.5 point Texans favored line to 7. And honestly, I have to take it. I have to take the Texans because that's just the nature of, where the Jaguars are right now. And they're 0-3 until they prove me otherwise. And so be sure to head over to mybookie.ag, sign up today using promo code 1010XL for a double deposit bonus. And honestly, put your money on the Texans. And that's just me from the perspective of until I see it on the field, I can't in good faith say that the Jaguars offensively are going to get this together. I say it and I hope I'm wrong because there certainly is the talent on this roster to make that turnaround. But I think that this is a team that until they get the taste of a win in their mouth, I just don't see it, Gus. How about you?
No, I'm right there with you where it's in the territory of I got to see it to believe it. And so I was going to add that an alternate spread for the Texans probably makes a lot of sense, like -10 or -11 or something like that, because I don't think it's going to be like as big of a bloodbath as it was last week, because how could it be? But yeah, I'm expecting a double-digit point Texans win. I think they're legit. I think they're true contenders, and the Jaguars on the other side of the spectrum in terms of NFL teams this season.
But you know what? Like the one thing I'll throw out there, when the Jaguars went to Houston, and again, it was a very different mindset of a Jaguars outfit when they went to Houston week 12 last year. However, I don't think even at that juncture, despite the fact that he was approaching double-digit sacks, I don't think anyone would have expected Josh Hines-Allen to do what he did in the second half of that game and get after C.J. Stroud the way he did. Trayvon Walker also was effective in that game. And I would like to think those two guys, among others, have taken to heart a lot of the chatter in the outside world over the last 4 days regarding where has the Jaguars pass rush gone. 41 gets paid. 44 was supposed to take the next step. It looked like he was in week 1 of this season. He has disappeared the last 2 weeks. Look, like if there's ever a game for those guys to say, no, like what you saw last year is who we are. This is the game, not only because it matters so much in the divisional race, but also because if you can generate some form of a pass rush, yes, CJ Stroud is unflappable, but that's your best chance against this trio of wide receivers that he's going to be targeting. And we didn't even discuss Dalton Schultz, who not only because he's on my fantasy team, but also because I think he's an underrated tight end and has proved to be a nice safety valve for Stroud as well.
Yeah, I don't think Dalton Schultz is anything of like a needle mover, but if he's like your 4th option in the passing game, that's definitely a good thing. Just as long as he's not like the number 1 or number 2 for you, I think you're okay there. So, all right, Mia, thank you for joining the show. You can find Mia on Helmets and Heels, which she co-hosts from noon to 2 each weekday, except for Thursdays, right?
We do have a show today, though, Gus.
Oh, okay.
No, because we don't have any Jaguars programming due to Everbank Stadium being a city-owned facility, and all city-owned facilities are closed today due to Hurricane Helene. So maybe that's why we have some more users also in the chat this morning, because I know a lot of businesses are closed and what have you, and a lot of people working from home. And so, yes, because there's no Jags programming, I do have to brave Helene, and I do have to go into 1010XL Studios today, but that's A-okay. I'll talk to you guys from 12 to 2.
Sounds good. All right, Mia, thank you.
Bye, guys.
Talk to you next Thursday. All right, y'all. I'm going to be completely honest. It's been a long week, and I did not have any time to do a little quote section, so we're just going to skip that. But I'm gonna bring it back, and it's going to be new and improved next week. So look out for a better quote section, a better little news roundup section next time. So let's just get straight into chat therapy. Take your guys' comments. Dell's been up in here. What's up, Dell? He said, just let Doug take over offensive and defensive play calling, and let's cook. Let's see if they can get that number 1 overall pick, right? He also said, first time in chat, but haven't missed an episode. Really enjoying the pod. Appreciate that, Dell. I'll make sure if you guys are on Twitter/X, go follow at Delphonic. Just go find him. He's an amazing Jags Twitter follow. Great guy, really funny. He also said Josh Hines-Allen looking slow. I'm not saying Hines correctly because he spelled it Heinz. Not spelling it correctly until he gets a sack. Yeah, I think that's fair. I mentioned, I think on the last Duval rundown show, that it's pretty disappointing so far what Josh Allen has done. I know that he has a high PFF grade, but like, okay, like every Jaguars fan who has watched a game has been underwhelmed by the impact that they can see from Josh Hines Allen. And so I think he certainly needs to step it up this week. And he has tough competition in Laramie Tunsil, who Mia was talking about a little bit earlier. And Tunsil honestly had one of the worst games he's had in a while last week against the Vikings because he had a lot of penalties, but then lost not a great game after the snap too. And so Josh Hines Allen is certainly going to need to step up. I think Delphonic partly said that Hines Allen is looking slow because there's a rumor going out there. I don't know where it came from that Hines Allen was asked by coaches to put on a couple of pounds going into this season. So, I mean, that honestly makes sense considering they were going from a 3-4 scheme to a 4-3 scheme. So Josh Hines Allen was actually kind of sort of changing positions from an outside linebacker standing up a lot of the time to handed a dirt defensive end. And so I get them wanting him to bulk up a little bit and put on a few pounds. I haven't necessarily thought that he looked slow to me, but he just hasn't looked noticeable to me. And so, like I was saying, that me and I were saying that the pass rush is going to be huge for any kind of upset hopes for the Jaguars this weekend, and it definitely starts out with number 41. Robert Collins said the team needs therapy. Yeah, I wonder what kind of like just team-wide therapy thing they can do. They bring in one therapist to address the whole room at once. Because going one by one, that would take too long. That would be a lot of crying sessions or something. Let's see. H-Town Highlights commented earlier. How do you guys feel about your tackles going against Hunter and Anderson Jr.? I feel like our interior D-line can be better, but our edge rusher helps pick up that slack. Yeah, I thought H-Town Highlights that Houston's defensive line was going to be not necessarily, or their interior defensive line was not necessarily going to be one of the best in the league, but certainly above average, especially with the offseason additions of Foyesade, Faluakin. I think I butchered that. Foley Faluakin. Wow, I'm just completely forgetting his name. I'm sorry. Lorenzo, I don't even know. I'm sorry. I'm so tired, you guys. But anyway, they made some interior defensive tackle adds in the offseason. But yeah, so to answer your question, I think that Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson Jr. are going to feast against Jacksonville's offensive tackles just because it's been, I think, probably the most underwhelming part of the season so far is that Cam Robinson has been, I think, slowly declining a little bit, but still, like, he's been probably the worst player on the offense so far this year, and so that's disappointing for someone who's paid as a top 10 left tackle. And then Anton Harrison was a guy that I think a lot of people, both locally and nationally, were expecting to take a jump forward in his sophomore season after really impressing and really growing a lot throughout his 21-year-old rookie campaign. But yeah, Anton has been pretty rough. He also sustained a foot injury last week. I think Cam Robinson is also on the injury report with a knee injury. And so it's rough. This is probably, I mean, Von Miller and Greg Rousseau last week definitely tore the group to shreds, but I think this Houston pass rush might be the best that Jacksonville faces all year. And so Trevor Lawrence is definitely going to need, and Doug Peterson is going to have to scheme up a lot of quick passes to get the ball out of Trevor's hand just for the sake of being worried about both Hunter and Anderson Jr. If there was just one of them, then I'd say, okay, like maybe, even though the Jaguars coaches haven't really shown an affinity for doing this, I'd say, okay, maybe they can chip a little bit with a running back or a tight end on one side and kind of like take care of the problem. But when you have just dudes on both sides of the line of scrimmage, it's going to be tough. Thank you, Dell. Fatikazi. That was such a big, I don't know, brain fart. That was crazy. It was Foley Fatukasi was the Jaguars defensive lineman who signed with the Texans this offseason. They also got a good guy from the Titans. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to go, you guys. I'm going to have to go get some sleep. It's been a long, short week, if that makes any sense. But this is our third Duval rundown in 4 days, I think. So we will be back on Sunday with Ryan Hacker-Green and Tommy McManus to break down whatever the heck happens in Texans versus Jaguars on Sunday. Danico Entree, thank you, H-Town Highlights. You guys are saving me in the comments today. Nico Autry was the other defensive tackle that the Texans picked up. So, yeah, that's about it. I'll see you guys on Sunday. I'll have more sleep by then. So, thank you guys for showing up and commenting. See you next time.